Happy New Year, everyone, and welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Jack Malde, Senior Policy Analyst at the Bipartisan Policy Center. In this week's episode, BPC Senior Advisor Theresa Cardinal Brown is going to take us through the latest negotiations on a potential border security deal on Capitol Hill. Such a deal is looking vital if we are to avoid a government shutdown and provide emergency funding to Ukraine. Then, Theresa and I interview Lindsay Milliken, an immigration fellow at the Institute for Progress. Lindsay is the lead author of a new IFP report detailing a data-driven method to identify workforce shortages. This report is very timely, given that the Department of Labor is currently soliciting input on how to update their Schedule A shortage occupation list. We're kicking off 2024 with a bunch of must-know immigration policy stuff, so stay tuned. So, Theresa, Happy New Year, and welcome back to This Week in Immigration.
Happy New Year to you too, Jack.
Thank you. So, before we left for the end-of-year break, we were reading about efforts of a bipartisan group of senators to negotiate a package of reforms to the asylum system at the border as part of President Biden's request for supplemental funding for Ukraine, Israel, and Southeast Asia. We're back now, so let's find out where things stand. So, firstly, Theresa, were the senators successful over the holidays in negotiating a deal?
Not successful. They're not done. They're still talking, so that's good. But they did not come to an agreement. So they're over the holidays. Their staffs continued to meet. The members talked occasionally, even though Congress was on recess. The issues are still very live, and I think they're still trying, but they haven't come to agreement yet.
Yeah, can you tell us what the various positions on these issues are from the different parties, and why is this deal so hard to lock down?
Yeah. So going back to sort of how we got here, at the end of the year, President Biden proposed a supplemental funding bill to Congress. So Congress annually passes appropriations to fund the government. This is sort of the regular budgetary requirements of funding the government. But occasionally, there are things that happen that require money for the government over and above the annual budget. And that means the president has to basically go back to Congress and ask for more money. So this supplemental was to supplement the existing money that was allocated by Congress, both in fiscal year 2023 and fiscal year 2024, which started October 1st, that has been funded under something called a continuing resolution. Continuing resolution is when Congress hasn't passed its full year appropriations bills, so they allow the government to keep spending at the last year's rates until they tell it what its New Year's rates are. But President Biden said, hey, look, we have these emergency situations going on. The war in Ukraine is still going on. Israel, the war that started in October between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. And we have promised Ukraine and Israel that we would support them militarily. We also have an increasing tensions in Southeast Asia with China and Taiwan that we need to have money to address. And oh, by the way, we need at least $14 billion more to deal with the migration at the border. So by adding the border money into this supplemental funding request for these other foreign policy priorities, the Biden administration itself is the one that sort of made talking about the border the way to get the other money. And Republicans took that and said, hey, we're not just going to give you more money. We want to see policy changes enacted into law that have you deal with the situation at the border differently than you have been. And so that started this negotiation. The key negotiators in the Senate have been Senator Lankford on the Republican side, Kirsten Sinema, who's an independent from Arizona, Chris Murphy, a Democrat from Connecticut, another Democrat, Senator Michael Bennet from Utah, had been involved. On the Republican side, Senator Tom Tillis of North Carolina has been involved. But the three, I think, central figures right now are Lankford, Sinema, and Murphy. And they and their staffs have been working very, very hard to try to come up with a set of policy changes. And at the heart of those policy changes are changes to how people asking for asylum at the border are treated. Now, the House previously had passed a bill, H.R. 2, back early in 2023, that was their ideas of how they would address the border. And it was a lot of very strict requirements, for example, that no one could qualify for asylum who had passed through another country unless they first applied for asylum there. So the Biden administration has a regulation that kind of does that, but there are exceptions. This would be no exceptions. Absolutely have to do it. It would reinstate a sort of Title 42 like authority that says the government is not able to have operational control of the border. And operational control is something that was set in statute years ago. And it's basically zero unlawful entries at the border, which is an impossible standard to attain. But unless they have operational control, they have to reject everybody at the border under a Title 42 like authority. There's other provisions that would mandate e-verify and every employer in every job across the country. So very strict policies. There were no Democrats that supported that bill in the House. And the Senate said, we're not going to take it up. And President Biden threatened to veto it. But that's still, I think, where the House, at least House Republican leadership, has insisted that that's still their position. They want to see that enacted, even though it doesn't have a chance. I think in the Senate, you have Democrats who are very concerned about not passing this foreign aid, who are willing to have some conversations about changes to the asylum system, and are started this conversation with Senator Langford and Tillis and Sinema. And I think they are making progress. They're working on compromises. Nobody's going to get everything they want. But the parameters of what's included in this deal keep changing. So the latest information just this week is that now they're talking about adding some other things in, like perhaps dealing with the Afghans who came after we left Afghanistan and giving them a permanent status, or dealing in some way with some form of the DACA or Dreamer population. Now, those are efforts to try to get some Democrats to support these more strict border changes, like increasing the threshold for applying for asylum, for example. Another thing that we're not sure whether is in or out of the negotiations is changes to the president's parole authority. So, parole has been the authority that the president used to create these specialized programs for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans that allows them, if they have a sponsor in the United States, to apply to come from their country, fly into the United States on a plane, and avoid the entire smuggled route up through Mexico and the land border. And that has been a pretty successful program. It certainly has resulted in lower numbers of Cubans, Nicaraguans, and Haitians at the border. Not so much for Venezuelans. And one of the suppositions is that Venezuelans don't have as many people in the United States willing to sponsor them. And so they don't have the alternative to use this program. But it is also still relatively small compared to the number of arrivals that we're seeing. It's only 30,000 a month of those populations. But Congress, particularly Republicans, have said this is far beyond what is considered when this parole authority was created. These are blanket policies that are basically allowing the president to create new legal ways to come to the United States that Congress didn't authorize. And so they needed to be stopped. So I think there's still some disagreements. There's also just larger political issues at play. This week, some Republicans have said they want to see metrics of security at the border to condition further Ukraine aid in this bill. I'm not sure that will get a majority of votes. And so it's become, I think, a little bit of a slog to try to get this thing done.
Yeah. So the month of December saw the highest number of encounters ever recorded at the border. Would the policies being proposed on the Hill actually help with the situation at the border?
Well, I think that's one of the things that's making this negotiation quite difficult, because I think that between Republicans and Democrats, there's a different view of what would work. I think Republicans really do believe that they can deter people from coming and lower the number of arrivals by denying them access to asylum, reinstating things like Title 42 or a similar authority that's not based on a public health rationale, the migrant protection protocols, using e-verify to cut off the ability for people to get work. But I would say that our own analysis, and certainly a report that we put out in December that looks at the timeline of various policies that have been in place at the border since the Obama administration, along with the numbers of encounters, show that none of these policies that have previously been put in place have resulted in a long-term decline in the number of arrivals. They've maybe had short-term impacts, but almost always the numbers have gone up later. And also, there's been just so many different policies in place at the border over different times, including times when there are overlapping policies, that confusion is actually detrimental to knowing whether any particular policy has an impact. So I think that's one of the challenges. I think Democrats simply believe, for the most part, or many Democrats do, because there's been criticisms of what the negotiators are trying to talk about, that there's nothing wrong with our existing system but resources, and we just need to fund it to capacity so people can get to a decision. I think personally, and this is my opinion, not necessarily anybody else's, but I think we have to recognize that the current number of rivals is just unsustainable at any level of resources we would put into it, because we can't keep up with the continuous arrivals. So, some combination of policy changes and resources is going to be needed. Policy changes without resources to apply those changes to the number of arrivals we have now would just mean that the numbers would overwhelm the process and people would have to be released anyway. So we have to recognize that resources have to be part of the solution, not just policy changes. And I think we need to recognize that it's not all about deterrence, because we've seen that when alternatives are available and people can take advantage of them, many people do, such as with the parole programs. So I think that's part of the struggle right now is those differing philosophies or viewpoints of what will work at the border is creating a little bit of an impasse in some ways. Because at the end of the day, whatever they come up with, along with the rest of the package, has to get a majority of votes, probably from both parties in both the House and the Senate, and the president has to sign them. So it means it has to be bipartisan. It probably will not mean that you'll get all the Democrats or all the Republicans, but you can't lose so many from both parties that you don't have the numbers needed to pass it. So I think what the negotiators are trying to aim for is something that has enough people from both parties to say, this is a decent compromise. And the math in the Senate is a little different than the math in the House because there's a 60 vote threshold to even move a bill in the Senate. So you have to get, enough of the other party. On the House, they can pass it with a simple majority, but the speaker has to be willing to have that majority come from both parties, even if it's not necessarily a majority of his own party. And we saw what happened to Speaker McCarthy when that happened. So there's political peril there as well. And I think all of these things are just, clashing right now and creating challenges for getting a deal together.
Theresa, you mentioned the negotiations in December were planned to be part of a supplemental spending bill. And now we're hearing about the deadlines for funding the government on January 19th and February 2nd. Could the failure to get a border deal mean the government might actually shut down?
So right now, these border negotiations have not been attached to the bills that would fund the government for the rest of the fiscal year. However, there have been some folks in the House that have said and have encouraged the speaker to not pursue the full year funding bills unless the border stuff is negotiated and attached. If the speaker agrees with that, if they decide that that's the way they want to run, then yes, then the border negotiations could, if they don't get done and they don't get enough votes, they wouldn't be able to pass it in the House. I'm not sure where this is going at the moment. I don't think the leadership is intending to link passage of the full year funding to whatever happens on the border. I think that's still set aside for the supplemental, but things are changing very quickly. We're recording this on Thursday, January 11th. By the time this comes out next Tuesday, that may have shifted. So I do think that there is a possibility, and it's not a zero possibility. It may even be a decent possibility that, yes, the government funding could get caught up on this. I would hope not, simply because shutting down the government, I believe, and BPC believes, is never a good idea under any circumstances. It just has so many implications for the economy, for the American people, for the services they demand of their government. It's just never a good idea. So I hope that doesn't come to pass. And especially because we just talked about how hard it is to get this border deal anyway. It would be much, much better if we could fund the government and then continue to talk about this either in the context of a supplemental or frankly on its own. There's no requirement that whatever they come up with have to be attached to one of these other bills. It could pass on its own. More likely it will be attached to something, but they first have to get a thing. and then figure out how they pass it.
Yeah. So, what are the next steps to this? And do you have? I mean, you mentioned it's very difficult to know what's coming. There are a lot of uncertainties. Do you have any ideas what we're going to see happen next?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, as I mentioned, they're still negotiating, and news coming out today indicates they're trying to throw other policy ideas on there, probably as sweeteners. That we don't know the details of whatever is in the package yet. The negotiators are keeping that pretty close hold. We know buckets of ideas, but we don't know what they've agreed to. But they have indicated they have some areas of agreement, and then they have areas that they haven't yet agreed on. So it's not done until everything's done. That's an adage on Capitol Hill. But even once the members agree who are negotiating, and the White House is part of these conversations also, once they all agree on the parameters, then somebody has to write it into legislative language that can be enacted into law. And immigration law is highly technical. It's not straightforward. The law has been amended so many times since the base law in 1952 that parts of it don't hang together well. So whoever job it is to write the actual legislative language has a big job. And then you have to make sure that the language written actually does the things that the members believe it will do. And when I say it's technical, a comma in the wrong place could actually have an impact. There have been Supreme Court cases over whether it says may or shall. So that's what I mean when it has to be, the language has to be very thoughtfully considered and make sure that it does meet the standards that the members think they want and what they've agreed to. And that can take a little bit of time, no matter how fast everybody is working, because it takes a level of understanding of the law and how it actually works in practice to be able to know what the legislative language does. So again, they haven't agreed to everything. They still have to agree to it. We understand they're starting to write legislative text, maybe on the parts that they have agreed on, but nothing's going to be released till it's all set. And then they have to count votes. They have to see, will this pass, and is it doable? At this point, it's anybody's guess. It is a hard thing to do. I'm not gonna let anybody believe that this is a likely thing. They still have a long ways to go to get there, but I think we're highly encouraged that we're having a bipartisan conversation about what's needed at the border. I think it's been long overdue. We this issue of the border, the crisis at the border, I think we're beyond calling it a crisis, and we have to call it something else. But it's been going on for a decade, and it's not getting any better. It is only getting worse in terms of the numbers of arrivals and the capacity of the government to manage it. So we are going to have to keep working on this.
Great. Well, thanks, Teresa, for breaking that down for us. We're going to take a short break, but when we come back, we'll be chatting to Lindsay Milliken from the Institute for Progress about Schedule A and identifying workforce shortages. So don't go anywhere. Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. Theresa and I are delighted to welcome Lindsay Milliken from the Institute for Progress to talk to us about her new report detailing a data-driven method to identifying workforce shortages and hopefully inform an update to DOL's Schedule A shortage occupation list. Lindsay has several years of experience working at the intersection of immigration and science and technology policy. Before joining IFP, she worked at the delegation of the European Union, supporting the Science Counselor on research, development, and policy relations between the US and the EU. She has also worked at the Federation of American Scientists, where she researched issues relating to high-skilled immigration. Welcome, Lindsay.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's great to have you. So, Lindsay, before we dive into your new report, let's start with some context. Can you tell us about Schedule A, what it is and why it's so important?
It's a great question. So, Schedule A comes out of the Department of Labor's authority to make sure that when an employer is hiring a foreign worker, they are not adversely affecting US workers. And a lot of people don't really realize this, that DOL is actually the third leg of the stool in the immigration process. And their entire responsibility all deals with making sure that US workers are not harmed when an employer hires someone from outside the country. So, Schedule A is supposed to be the list of occupations where DOL has already certified that if an employer is hiring in one of those occupations, they don't have to prove to DOL that they are not adversely affecting U.S. workers. This can actually save a lot of time for the employer. This is months of processing time and also several $1,000s of work. And it's honestly, it's been neglected. The last time that the Schedule A list was updated was 1991, which is also the same year that the internet was created. So we are clearly in a different time than it was when it was last updated. And right now, the list only contains physical therapists and nurses. So clearly, there needs to be an update, and it could have a pretty big impact on the sorts of high demand for uh, workers in critical occupations like healthcare and in semiconductor manufacturing, for example.
So, Lindsay, we're hearing a lot about Schedule A in recent months. You mentioned healthcare is one places, and nurses have been using Schedule A for many years, and clearly there's a need post COVID. Everyone has documented that. But the president just recently in October issued an executive order on artificial intelligence that prominently contained a directive to the Department of Labor to look at Schedule A. So, can you tell us what the executive order said about Schedule A and what DOL is doing in response to it?
Yes, the executive order is actually, I think, one of the biggest that has ever been released. So it's massive, sets out a lot of goals for AI development, but a big portion of the positive contributor to development in AI is actually having enough talent to do the work, to do the research, to make sure that the AI is safe. So this is a big chunk of the executive order is to orient the science agencies and also the immigration agencies towards thinking about how they can act to attract and retain talent related to artificial intelligence. And where DOL fits in is that the White House asked DOL within 45 days of the issuance of the executive order to publish a request for information about how they should update Schedule A. So they are requesting the public send in information about what sorts of occupations should be on the list, how they should update the list into the future, and in particular, with a particular focus on STEM workforce and also the skilled technical workforce, which is the category of workers that have some college education or professional certifications.
Yeah, that RFI was obviously a great thing to see. It does seem like incredibly good timing because obviously you, Lindsay, you've released this report on workforce shortages recently. So I have to ask, was this a lucky coincidence or did you actually plan this in some way?
So I think it was probably a little bit of both. I've been working on the report with my colleagues at IFP and also with one of the non-resident fellows at Brookings, Bragg White. We've been working on the report for about a year, so we have had ongoing conversations with the Department of Labor and with the White House about this issue while we were working on the report. And we had some inklings that there was probably going to be some activity from the White House on Schedule A at some point in the fall or the end of the year, but we didn't know when exactly it was coming. So we wanted to make sure that our report came out before the end of the year so that we were timing it with what ended up being the executive order and the request for information. And we published our report pretty much the day that the request for information was released at DOL. So that was pretty good timing, I think.
Yeah. I just want to add a follow on there because you said you've been working on this for quite some time, and there's been conversations inside the administration. You were talking with DOL, but Schedule A isn't a new thing, right? Schedule A has been around, it's been part of the law for decades, but it hasn't been updated in a very long time and pre-existed 1991. That's just the last time it was updated. Why do you think it's been so long since DOL has done this? They don't need a statute. They wouldn't have needed an order from the president to update Schedule A. What are some of the things reasons you think that it hasn't been updated in so long?
That's a really great question. And yeah, just to emphasize your point, Schedule A has been around since 1965. And between 1965 and 1991, it was updated several times. It's had a variety of different occupations and even skill sets or levels of credentials on the list. For example, PhDs or master's degrees were included on Schedule A in the very early versions. The reason why it probably hasn't been updated since 1991, there's probably a variety of reasons. One of them being that there were some assorted lobbying efforts from a lot of healthcare groups to shrink the size of the list, mainly because there was a concern that there would be a doctor surplus in the 2000s, which turned out to not be true. And doctors used to be on Schedule A for several years. So that's how they were removed from the list, most likely. Some of the other concerns that DOL might have about this are workload related. So they have had an increasing workload over the past few decades, especially as we've added many new types of jobs and many more immigrants than we had in the past to the US. So there's sort of a concern that it's a difficult thing to balance with the other workload that they have. It can be a challenge to assess what types of occupations are in shortage, but the purpose of our paper really was to show to DOL that it is possible to do this in a data-driven way. It doesn't have to take a lot of resources to do it. It can be fairly self-executing. You push a button and it just spits out a list for you. We're hopeful that this report can be a really good start to the conversation with DOL about the feasibility of updating Schedule A now, but also establishing a process so that it's updated regularly into the future.
So let's move on to the report itself then. You told us a little bit about the objective of the report, but let's talk about the approach you took. You said that, you see that there's data-driven ways to do this, and it sounds like this is something, basically a formula that you can use, input data and output a list of occupations. But tell us about how you've created that methodology.
It's a great question. We were sort of almost starting from scratch because there really hasn't been a lot of work from DOL about how they used to update this list in the past. There really isn't a lot of public documentation about how they used to do these updates. We know that in the early 90s, the late 80s, the early 90s, there was an economist named Malcolm Cohen who was tasked by the Department of Labor to come up with a methodology to update Schedule A. And he did, and he wrote an entire book outlining how this methodology would work. And for some reason, DOL never adopted it. So what we did is we studied the way that his method is set up, and we also looked to other countries' examples of shortage occupation lists. There are actually a lot of countries that adjust their immigration laws depending on which occupations are in shortage. The one that is the most well known is the UK's shortage occupation list. And this is one that we borrowed quite heavily from. And in our report, we include a comparison between what the UK's method with US data would look like and what our method, which is tweaked a bit, we added some more cutting edge research to our method and how those two would compare to each other.
Yeah, and in the report, you've got this index called the Help Wanted Index. So, for the more technically minded listeners, do you mind telling us a bit more about that and how it identifies and ranks shortage occupations?
Sure. So we have 10 different indicators that all measure different aspects of the labor market for each occupation. We use the census SOC codes. So they are basically 6-digit numbers that identify all the occupations in the US and categorize them. We use the 5-digit version, which is slightly less specific. And this was because we had some sample size issues at the 6-digit level. There was just not enough information to be able to confidently tell which occupations would be in shortage versus others. And so some of the indicators that we use for these occupations are things like percentage change in median wage over 1 and 3 years, job vacancy postings per worker, unemployment rate for 1 year and also 3 years. And one of the newest indicators, one of the ones that we added, which is based on new research, is called the job-to-job transition rate. So this is something where it is measuring how frequently workers are transitioning to jobs within an occupation. So if there is a high rate of transition between jobs in an occupation, that kind of tells us that there is a lot of competition for these workers. There are a lot of opportunities to get a job, and then that might indicate that there is a higher demand or a labor shortage in that occupation. And the reason that we chose longer term and short term indicators is because we really wanted to balance between long term and short term trends. So essentially, we didn't want to be using solely the most recent data that we can obtain from the federal government, because we don't want to be responding to shortages that would resolve themselves within the market. A change in wage resolving that labor demand by itself. We also don't want to focus solely on shortages that have been around for a long time, because then that means that the list is not as responsive to labor market demands or new industries or recent changes that it really should be responsive to. So we try to strike a balance between those two things. All the indicators are weighted evenly, and they're all scored. So the numbers that are scored, the average for each indicator, is then ranked. So that's how we get our massive list of how every single occupation is ranked on these indicators. But then you need a threshold. You can't just have every single thing on Schedule A. So our threshold is also intended to be responsive to labor market conditions. So we wanted it to increase when there were a lot of job openings, the market was doing really well, and we wanted it to shrink when the market was not doing very well. So our threshold is we assign the highest ranking occupations to the list until the number of workers in those occupations equals the number of workers in occupations with unemployment rate lower than 1.8%. So this would mean that when there's a lot of demand and that the market is doing very well, there's going to be a greater number of occupations with a very low unemployment rate. And so then the list gets larger. And when the market is not doing very well, there will not be very many occupations with such a low unemployment rate, and then the list gets shorter. Of course, one of the things that we wanted to emphasize is that this is just the start of the conversation. Our threshold is rather arbitrary. It could be 2% of unemployment, or we could weight labor force non-participation more than we weight change in median wage. We just decided to weight everything equally and choose this threshold as an example of what Schedule A could look like. We actually have a new tool that's going to come out very soon where you can make your own Schedule A list, where you can take the indicators that we have, weight them differently depending on what you think is the most important, and change the threshold, and then you can see what the list would look like based on your changes. So check that out when we release it on our website.
Let me ask a follow-up question because, one of the things that in our past research, looking at how other countries do these occupation lists, one of the things that's always added is future projections of job growth. So the occupations that may have been in shortage 5 years ago, they may not be the ones that are, growing fastest in the future and have more job openings. Is there any measurement in your index that kind of looks at that projected job growth in an occupational area and how that impacts potential future labor market? Because otherwise, we might be saying it's a shortage now, but we're authorizing people to come into the workforce permanently. What does that do in the future?
Right. It's a very good question. Our methodology does not include projected job growth. We did consider adding something like that, but when looking at the BLS's own projections, because they do a lot of projections for all sorts of different jobs and how they would grow or shrink over time, it says on their own website that this should not be used as a predictor of future job growth at all. It's a guess based on if the market in general remained the same for the next 10 years. And of course, labor markets don't remain the same for 10 years. So we decided for our our methodology, we did not include it, but it is something that is an option that could be included in a different type of methodology for this work.
So you also mentioned that you compared this to the UK. Were there other countries that you looked at, and sort of how does this index that you've come up compare to those countries? You said you make some changes to what, for example, what the UK did. What are some other comparatives?
We looked at Malaysia, for example, New Zealand, Australia. I've also looked at shortage lists for other European countries. Belgium has its own shortage list by province. So everybody does it a slightly different way. But the interesting part, and the reason why we chose the UK as our backbone to this method, is that a lot of them in their documents when setting up their shortage lists say that theirs is based on the UK's method, and they were inspired by how the UK did their system to build their own. So they're actually very similar to how the UK's works, tweaked slightly depending on how their immigration system works. I know, for example, one of them, this might be Singapore or might be Malaysia, actually is dedicated to attracting native born citizens back to their country. It's not intended for outside non-native workers to come to that country. It's really to bring their own citizens back. So we decided to use the UK's method because it seemed to be the start of many other different methods that other countries have used.
Great. So let's move on to the actual shortage occupations you highlight in the report. I noticed that there were largely STEM and health occupations, which wasn't too surprising to us at BPC. We've written about those as being in shortage before. But yeah, what were some of the most notable occupations highlighted, and were any of them surprising to you?
Yeah, there actually were a lot that were surprising to me. I think that some of the most interesting were the ones that ranked very highly. For example, atmospheric and space scientists and physicists ranked very highly. There were a lot of healthcare occupations that ranked very highly. One of the ones that was very interesting to me was that electronics and electrical engineers, which play a huge role in semiconductor manufacturing, which is a big priority for the White House right now, rank very highly on our list. So that was really interesting. What was also interesting were the occupations that actually did not show up. We've heard a lot about how there's a shortage of construction workers or workers in hospitality, for example, and those don't show up at all in our shortage list. They do quite well on a couple of the indicators, but then do not do well on a majority of them. So that was kind of surprising to me. And the other one that was surprising were teachers. People have talked a lot about how teachers are very clearly in shortage, and I believe that 100% that teachers are in shortage. But the reason we think that they did not show up in our method is because they're not really, for public schools specifically, they're not really operating under the freest market conditions. Their
Mhm.
salaries are set by the state. The number of jobs open are set by the state. So that's not something that can, respond very quickly even to normal market conditions. And for example, you wouldn't have a lot of job openings for teachers because you can't have a class full of students and have no teacher there. So instead of hiring the best, if they can't find the best person for the job, they'll hire the next best person or a person that's not as good, but they need to have someone there to teach the students. So the jobs don't stay unfilled for very long. So that's sort of one drawback from our method, is that it relies on very normal market conditions. And, if we talk to DOL about this method more, we would also mention this as something to be aware of, is that it's not quite, the data is not quite perfect to include occupations that might have constraints that are not foreseen or not easily measured, for example.
I think it's also worth noting that Schedule A doesn't preclude an individual employer from sponsoring somebody for a green card if they're willing to undertake that individual labor market test. So it's not an exclusive way. So teachers may not show up on the shortage list, but certainly a school district could still sponsor a teacher. They just have to do a recruitment and show they couldn't find a US worker for that particular job. So it's we're not trying to cover every circumstance in which an employer has difficulty finding a worker when we talk about Schedule A. And I think that's a nuance that's worth repeating here. So let me ask you, what's the reaction to this report been? You said you've had some conversations with the government. What about some of the other stakeholder organizations that think about labor unions or business organizations or immigration advocacy groups? What have folks had?
No, that's a really good question. And just to build off what you had said, it is very true that there is a lot of nuance here. And just because an occupation is not listed on Schedule A does not mean that they can't come here. And Schedule A should not be intended to be the solution for every single labor shortage that the US has. It really should be a solution that is used for when there are long lead times on education. Like with doctors, it can take a very long time to get a new doctor working in the community. Or if there really are shortages that are lasting for a very long time, several years, that don't seem to be remedied by the usual efforts, like raising wages, for example, or improving working conditions. This should really be used for more intractable, longer lead time shortages, as well as those that are come up from very high priority industries like semiconductor manufacturing, for example. To get back to your question, the reaction has been very positive. I think people are very excited that there seems to be at least some option, some solution that is relatively low cost to implement. Our method uses all publicly available data except for some information about job postings from which we take from Lightcast. But again, it's very, very easy to obtain this information. We did spend a year writing the report, but it's also because it can take a while. There are a lot of good answers to this question. There are a lot of options that you can do, so we had to make sure we were settling on the options that we thought were the best. But we think hopefully in future conversations with the administration and with DOL, they can consider it as maybe a starting point to build off their own method based on data that they have access to.
Yeah, and I want to ask, going forward, presumably we want Schedule A to remain responsive to changing labor market needs. Do you have plans to run your same analysis on a recurring basis so that you can continue to inform how Schedule A should be updated?
That's a great idea. I think that we're hoping to do something similar to that with our interactive tool so that we have the data sort of live. I think it would be a good idea to run this data again as we get new information because DOL and also the Census Bureau release information periodically throughout the year that would be very helpful for an analysis like that. What I think one of the next big projects that we're going to do related to this work is when the RFI closes, we're going to do an analysis of the responses that were submitted. And, because a lot of groups have great ideas, they might have sources of information that we didn't think of or that might be novel for DOL, and see if we can knit the comments together into a well-rounded proposal for DOL that incorporates the perspectives of many different people and is something that is transparent, easy to tweak, so that if there are changes in the future that would make this method more helpful, we can easily make those changes and have it be so that everybody can understand where the list is coming from instead of having it be some black box that it is right now.
So is there anything else you want to say about the report, either its conclusions or the work that you put into it and how long you've been working on it?
I have to say it was a really fun project to work on. I think it's been very gratifying to see this grow into the effort that it has been right now. We're working with a great coalition of different types of organizations, and I know Theresa, Theresa and Jack, you're very involved in our coalition, which is really great. It's hard to imagine that a paper that I had written on the regulatory history of Schedule A 3 years ago has grown into this actual real thing, and now an RFI and hopefully an update in the future. I just really want to say that I hope this jumpstarts the conversation for the agency to come up with a method that makes the most sense for them and just excited to see where it goes.
All right. We'd be absolutely remiss if we didn't give you an opportunity to tell people where they can find your report.
Yes, you can go to ifp.org and you can find all of our research there. It should be under the High Skilled Immigration tab. And you can also find a lot of great information about releases from IFP on our Twitter account and also by following me and Caleb Watney and Alex Stopp and all the great people at IFP.
Great. Thank you, Lindsay, so much for being here. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
And that's a wrap on this episode of This Week in Immigration. One last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow the Bipartisan Policy Center on the X platform at BPC_bipartisan. You can follow Theresa Cardinal Brown at BPC_T Brown. And you can follow me at Jack Malde. Send your comments and feedback to us by email to immigration@bipartisanpolicy.org. I'm Jack Malde. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by Theresa Cardinal Brown. This episode was written by myself and Theresa Cardinal Brown. Joshua Joe is our audio editor. The executive producer of BBC Podcasts is Lucy Manning. Talk to you next time on This Week in Immigration.